creativity and a potential risk for spreading disinformation?
Thank you for that question. Article 19, LP, and Thomson Reuters have been doing a research in 9 countries, 6 countries in Eastern Africa and 3 countries in Southern Africa. And we're looking at generative AI and why we need to pay attention to generative AI's developments vis-a-vis freedom of expression. Generative AI provides a very powerful tool for content creation. It has given my voice. It's not.
Oh, yeah, you can take the other mic.
Let me take the other mic. Thank you. Okay, now this is perfect. So I was saying that Article 19, Thomson Reuters and LP East Africa have been doing a research on generative AI and freedom of expression, and why we need to give a key attention to generative AI's developments vis-a-vis freedom of expression. The reason for this is because generative AI provides a very powerful tool for content creation. It has also made it possible for disinformation and misinformation content to be created. At the same time, we found that generative AI was going to bring to the forefront the same issues we've been grappling with vis-a-vis freedom of expression. Some of these issues include copyright law vis-a-vis freedom of expression or the right to share. It also brings to the foreground the issues of misinformation and disinformation. And we know that in tackling misinformation and disinformation, governments have been having the so-called fake news laws and legislation. We can see this in Ethiopia, we can see this in Uganda, in Kenya, in Tanzania, and so many other countries in the continent, having one sort of law on misinformation and disinformation. Now, these laws have been used not really to tackle misinformation and disinformation, but to silence critical voices, government dissidents, and activists who might be on the wrong side of the government of the day. So given the importance of generative AI in already continuing discourse around copyright and disinformation and misinformation, we thought it's important to look at it in the broader picture of generative AI, hence the research.
Thank you so much, Angela. Now I'll give it on to your colleague from ALP East Africa.
Thank you, Doreen. I just want to recognize some of the lawyers we've worked with on this research, and we have Bowman's, ALP, we have Getu in Ethiopia, and Case Solutions and Partners. So our research, just like Angela has explained, we are focusing on the laws, administrative measures on generative AI and content created by generative AI. So this also includes false information, freedom of expression, copyright, and corporate accountability. So I'm just going to share the initial findings, what we found so far. The research is not yet complete, but we have gathered some information. And when it comes to existing laws, one of the things we are trying to explore is what are the existing laws that govern generative AI in Eastern and South African countries, in the 9 countries that we selected. And we find that currently in all the 9 countries, there is no law that specifically provides for generative AI. And to be specific, I just want to mention the countries. We have Ethiopia, Kenya, Rwanda, South Africa, South Sudan, Tanzania, Uganda, Zambia, and Zimbabwe. So in these countries, if you are consuming or you are using generative AI or you're deploying it, there is no law that governs you. So what do countries do? So countries are resorting to existing laws like the data protection, and basically that is one of the things that they are relying on to manage and try and regulate generative AI. And key to note that when you are using the platform or when you're developing the key principles under these laws, I know so many people have issues with the data protection laws because some people say it's a copy and paste. but this is what we have right now in most of these countries. And the principles, the 7 principles of data protection, are very key for us and in the deployment and in the development process. And when it comes to administrative measures, case laws, because one of the things we need to know, we forget that beyond the existing laws, we also need to look at administrative measures. What are countries doing? And sometimes if there are no administrative measures, as lawyers, we look at another source of law is a case law. The jurisprudence has courts litigated on this issue. And when you look at the different jurisdictions, the 9 countries, there has not been any case filed regarding this. So there has not been any pronouncement whatsoever to lay jurisprudence on generative AI. But when it comes to administrative measures, we have Rwanda and South Africa and Kenya have taken some action. For Rwanda, they have the national AI policy, which basically lays foundation and a roadmap, basically shows the responsible and ethical use of AI. So it talks about AI generally, but it also applies to generative AI. And when you look at the third area of focus in our research on limiting the laws that limit publication of false information. And when you look at all the countries apart from South Sudan have laws that actually, existing laws that limit on publication of false information. And just like my colleague Angela has illustrated to us, one of the important things that we need to note that whereas we should limit false information, but some of these laws we have interrogated so far may actually restrict freedom of expression. It may be used to counter false information, but there are some loopholes, some lacunas in the laws, and that need to be reviewed to make sure that their people are allowed to communicate freely and also express their opinions. Look at an example of one of the countries that have the strictest laws when it comes to false information is Rwanda. It is very strict, and of course it is understandable when you look at the background of genocide. You know, when you talk about hate speech, incitement of violence, and all, the laws are so strict, and these laws are not speaking specifically to generative AI, but then also have an implication on generative AI. The other point that we first understand when you talk about freedom of expression is that the underlying principle is tolerance. You know, you have a right to tolerate one another. And it doesn't matter whether the opinion is popular or unpopular. So even when you're using generative or AI, this principle actually applies to you. Now, when you look at the existing laws of most countries, they do not speak specifically to generative AI or AI when you come up with content on, information on when you're expressing yourself. The law does not specifically provide or regulate generative AI, but when you look at the constitutions of the different countries, they guarantee the right to freedom of expression. And this freedom is not just for only digital rights, but for all rights. So by the fact that there is a guarantee under the Constitution, it also applies on the use of generative AI on the different platforms. And lastly, the copyright laws that Angela's talked about. We also looked at the copyright laws, and most of the copyright laws still do not provide. There is nothing that provides specifically for generative AI or content created by AI. But when you read the different laws, especially South Africa, Uganda, and Kenya, when you read the copyright and neighboring rights acts of those jurisdictions, they try to define something known as a computer program. Now, program, in the definition of a computer program, it actually covers generative AI because it basically talks about instructions. You give a computer an instruction, and then the computer will give you feedback, and that is generative AI. So indirectly, it does not provide for it, but it has an effect. So when you are using generative AI under the Copyright Act, you are protected. Now, the issue is when it comes to infringement and ownership, and whether the question that begs an answer is, if I am content has been created by generative AI, who is the author? Now, the question in all the acts goes to the person who created the computer program. Why? Because the copyright laws look at juristic persons and natural persons. So if it is artificial intelligence cannot own works they produce. So the copyright rests in the person who created that program, the model, the artificial intelligence. So even when it comes to infringement, those are some of the things that we have to look at. Now, the issue comes in when you generate content, and then that content affects another person. The question is, who would be liable? And now that's when regulations come in from the different countries. Regulations on content created on social media and content created online. And these basically the person who shares that content, when you look at the laws, for example, in Uganda, the UCC regulations and guidelines on online and social media content. So basically, the person who shares that information would be liable, not the person or the author of the system or the software. So briefly, this is our research. We are still building on it, and I've just given a brief overview. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that comprehensive overview. Before I move on to the next set of questions, Angela, would you like to add anything on the findings that you might have seen from research on the impact of Gen AI and its regulation on freedom of expression in Eastern and Southern Africa?
Maybe just to add that what generative AI presents is a call for all of us to make sure we have robust corporate human rights responsibilities framework, because we realize that unlike other ways in which we've been responding to digital rights, generative AI really requires a robust corporate human rights framework. We need to see how they're going to design generative AI products and make sure that they have a human rights due diligence as well as a risk mitigation plan of sorts to deal with the human rights violations that can occur from Gen AI. So maybe just to add the need for corporate human rights responsibility.
Thank you so much, Angela. My next question is to representatives from MISA. So can you provide an overview of the key findings from your report, the Artificial Intelligence in Southern Africa report, and what are the most critical insights by AI about AI uptake, use, and impact in the region?
The AI in Southern Africa report is an assessment report which was made by Mrs. Zimbabwe, and it was assessing the application of AI in Southern Africa. And from its findings, we realized that nations in Southern Africa are at their early stages, and many pilot projects and development-driven businesses models demonstrated that the potential for AI and a benefit. Sorry, can I take it again?
Yes.
Okay. The models demonstrated that the potential of AI benefits areas like undeserved areas and better connect local communities and international technology firms, as well as improve lives. However, these emerging technologies from cryptocurrency, 5G, AI presents challenges and new opportunities, especially with these transitions where we are coming up with frameworks based on the Western regions, and they really have to fit our African context which is different from the Western, where we are grappling with infrastructure. We are still behind, we are still digitizing, and the conversation hasn't really reached a artificial intelligence component. So some of the challenges which were noted from this report were the deficiencies in AI readiness, looking at technology capacity and policy making faced by African countries. The second set of challenge, and was the focus of the paper, deficiency in the intent of the architecture of AI systems and how they are being developed. And the last one was misuse of AI for the developing world. AI also contributing to targeting humanitarian relief, address climate impacts, and support the sustainable development goals. My colleague.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you, Chido. That sounds very comprehensive. I just want to add one or two things onto what she has said. The biggest problem that we see is that there's a vacuum in terms of regulation in the whole of Southern Africa, at least I can speak about. And that vacuum, unfortunately, governments will be ready to fill it. And when they fill it, they are going to come with laws that probably infringe on freedom of expression, freedom of association, and our rights. Our right to privacy. So because of this vacuum, we are trying to work with the government, but government is also not too sure what AI is. Across the region, they are not too sure what AI is, and they are a bit slow in regulating it. For example, in Zambia, now they have an AI policy. Nobody has ever seen it. They just talk about it and say, hey, it was funded by the EU, I think. And because of that vacuum, we are in a very terrible space that could be filled in, like what happened when the internet came in. When COVID came in, there was a vacuum, and all of a sudden there were all these fake news laws that were produced across the whole of Southern Africa, and most of them haven't been repealed. And so there's need for us to, can I say, strike the iron when it's still hot, because intervening now and trying to reach out to governments as much as we can before they come up with their own policies. Just to give you another example of the gaps that are there. A few years ago, because AI is terrible at recognizing black people, a few years ago, China wanted to train its model on facial recognition of black people. And the country that they came to was Zimbabwe. And Zimbabwe was willing to give away so much of our data to the Chinese. I think the deal failed. I'm not too sure what happened, but the fact that our governments are willing to do that when there's money at stake, and because China doesn't ask too many questions about rights, our governments will do it. So this vacuum is creating a potential for government to come in and infringe on our rights. So I think the best that we can do at this moment, particularly thanks to the report that we produced, is to continue raising awareness about AI, possibilities and risks, and how it can be deployed and used in Southern Africa. Just on a quick note as well, in terms of identifying, I grew up in a town called Bulawayo in Zimbabwe, and the mayor is white. There are not so many white people in Zimbabwe now, but if you go to Meta, Facebook, Twitter, etc., and ask it to imagine the mayor of Bulawayo, it will show you a black person. So that is the amount, there's lack of data from us as well, and this is a vacuum as the African continent and Southern Africa, to be specific, that we need to come together and see how we can train these models to bring us data that is relevant to us, not that is just imagined by the West. So there's, just to reiterate my point, there's a big vacuum that we need to work together as civil society, as government, to raise awareness before, before government comes in. We saw with the cyber security laws that came in across most of Africa, they are really not cyber security laws, but they are criminalizing the use of the internet and online platforms. And if we sleep on AI at the moment, we are going to see a repeat of what happened in the past few years. I think on that note, I'll leave it here.
Thank you so much for your comprehensive insights. Now I'll give the floor to Access Now. So can you tell us about human rights perspectives on AI?
Yeah, and I think a lot has already been said, and just reflecting also on some of the issues that Edmund has mentioned and Ngaba has mentioned, for instance, and talking about just how AI regulation or governance does not exist in a vacuum. So just thinking about it, first of all, as a human rights issue, it's definitely good to recognize that the conversations are already being had, which is a really good thing. We've had a resolution from the UN, we've had a report from the advisory at the UN, just mentioning things such as just the fact, even the most elementary fact that human rights matter when it comes to AI governance, or the deployment of programs that develop, that rely heavily on automated or artificial intelligence rather. But at the same time, and I think it was Edmund that mentioned this, one thing that recurs often for us as a region is, of course, the copy and paste, the Brusselsization of our laws, and this is not unique to Africa. Obviously, it happens all over the global majority. And so because of this, we have to a little bit pay attention to what's happening in other regions, especially with the EU having the AI Act already, which has its own set of problems. It's not perfect, but unfortunately, it could end up being imported as is, right? But just thinking about human rights and some of the stopgap mechanisms that have been put in place, whether this is through report or resolution or guidelines or frameworks, there's still a lot of exemptions, and we know how that works, especially for us as a region. There are a lot of exemptions, for instance, national security. How many times do you hear the national security argument, especially when you're talking about safeguarding human rights? So when you think about things like that and just how vague some of these laws and guidelines and frameworks are, especially when it comes to human rights language, which is weak, it's not as strong, not as stringent, not as detailed, it becomes a little bit worrying to think about how AI is going to be governed in the next 5, 10 years, and even how it is at this time. But just thinking about what human rights respecting governance would look like, short answer: transparency, equity, and accountability. And what does this look like, especially when we talk about transparency? The first thing that we need to ask ourselves is this necessary? And quite interestingly, just as we were coming into Dakar for Fifth Africa, we had the Kenyan President Ruto speaking about AI and how it's being used for decision making in Kenya, and this includes for student, funding, education, student aid, and medical aid, and fertilizer. And the way this has been gone about is just as usual. We hear about it on the news just like everybody else. There is no policy in place to actually govern how the systems and programs are being deployed. Is it absolutely necessary? Do we have enough data to even make these decisions in a manner that actually benefits people and doesn't leave people who've been historically marginalized already even further at the margins? So just thinking about whether something is absolutely necessary before we turn to techno-solutionism is the first question we need to ask ourselves when we're talking about human rights. And then, of course, there's human rights due diligence, and Angela has mentioned this as well. What due diligence has been done? Is there an impact assessment that has been done? Do we understand what the impact will be? Are there any mitigation measures that have been put in place? A lot of the time, no. Looking at adequate guidelines as well, and I've spoken about this a little bit, just talking about what laws already exist, and even the UN report that just came out recently says these guidelines or frameworks don't exist in a vacuum. So what laws do we already have? Are those laws human rights respecting? Are they adequate? For instance, we have data protection laws in most of Africa at this point, but at the same time, as Ngaba has just said, if something needs to be trained somewhere, our data is free for all, as long as there's a profit to be made, which is really, alarming. And this also kind of ties into fair business practices. A lot of the time we've heard that AI, whatever form of AI, models are trained here. So they're trained on our data by our people people are not being fairly compensated at the end of the day. Laws are not being followed, and there's a lot to say about this, especially when it comes to data protection and privacy, and how our laws have extraterritoriality, but that's not being respected. That's a whole other conversation to be had. But there are definitely a number of angles to look at when we talk about human rights and what human rights respecting governance model would look like. But again, going back to the shortest way to put it is transparency, equity, and accountability have to be paid attention to.
Thank you so much for sharing your insights on the human rights approach to AI. And now I'd like to move on to the second round of our questions. And I'm going back to Angela. So what are some of the most common regulatory approaches being proposed or implemented to address the challenges posed by Gen AI?
Yep, it's okay, I can answer that.
Okay.
There are mainly 4 things that the countries are handling, and in respect of regulating. And one of them is harnessing the existing laws. We've mentioned the data protection laws and those principles. So if you're developing or deploying AI, you need to ask yourself whether your AI model or the content you're generating falls within the 7 principles. And one of them is lawfulness, fairness, and transparency. There should be a limitation, and there should be data minimization. It should be accurate. So if you're generating data, you should know that it's actually accurate before you disseminate or before you share it with anyone. Accountability. And also the other issues to do with consent. So if you're consuming or you're going to share something that is generated from AI, do you have the required consent for whatever information you're sharing? The other is countries that have now started adopting national AI strategies and policies. Of course, Rwanda opened the Pandora box, and other countries are also following. Uganda is developing its national AI policy. We've just heard about it, but we are not yet sure. We don't know when it's coming out. Ethiopia has theirs. It will be released soon. South Africa is also working on a national AI strategy, and the same for Kenya. And now the question is, when are they going to be released? When are they going to be adopted? Because these strategies act as a roadmap to guide, in the absence of existing laws, to guide the different countries. So our legislators here, maybe this is the question we would like to hear from you. When are these policies and strategies going to be adopted? It's very important. 3 is the stakeholder engagements. Countries are engaging stakeholders from CSOs, from UN, UNESCO, and other communities to ensure that they work together with experts to review the existing laws and to come up with guidelines on how best they can regulate and ensure that there is ethical and responsible use of generative AI. And lastly is establishment of specific working groups and departments. Different countries have set up departments that are in charge of AI. So in case there is deployment, in case there is development, you need to seek some authority from some entities. Uganda recently set up a committee to spearhead AI by reviewing the existing laws. So they are going to review the existing laws and make sure that they're in tandem with international instruments and standards. So basically that is what countries are doing, but not also forgetting that now this is also being introduced in universities. In the University of Makerere, there is a course on AI, and also the University of Nairobi, there is also AI. So our research indicates that education is also another tool of regulation, because when you're teaching people the principles, the ethical guidelines and the principles, it gives them guidance on how they can develop and use artificial intelligence responsibly. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Edmund. Angela, do you have anything to add? And I'd also like to ask, this could go to either you or Edmund, how might disinformation laws designed to combat the negative effects of Gen AI risk curtailing freedom of expression?
Yeah. Thank you for that question. I had already alluded to the fact that we know that misinformation and disinformation laws have been used to curtail free expression. And when Article 19 was envisaging this research, we had in mind the fact that potential justifications for these laws is going to be we have more fake news or we have more misinformation, disinformation content being generated by AI. It's even becoming harder to detect. And I say this because I've been trained on fact-checking and verification. But even then, the AI evolution is faster and it's looking more and more real as time goes by. At Article 19, we have proposed and we continue to propose that misinformation and disinformation cannot be dealt with just as part of how to respond to misinformation and disinformation. And that does not change even in the age of AI. What needs to happen is for us to stop criminalizing, as my colleague has mentioned, just the mere use of computer systems. I see this in how we even label our computer and cybercrimes legislations. In East Africa, for some reason, our legislations are titled computer misuse. So already the definition or the attitude from the state is that this is something we need to limit, not something we want to encourage, not something we want to shape how we as a society grows. So from looking at it as something that is being misused, you see the laws also trying to perpetrate the same attitude of we need to stop people from doing this and that using a computer system, as opposed to training people on how they intake media, encouraging a media environment that is it has more multiple sources of information, I might say. Encouraging a population that is alive to the fact that sometimes images could be fabricated or images could be manipulated, and these are the things you need to look out for and stuff like that. Another thing that I need to mention about disinformation and misinformation laws is that we have seen over and over again that they're not really used to tackle fake news. And the challenge of having the state to have the opinion of what is truth and false is that the state decides that critical information is false. It can decide that activists' campaigns are false, right? And then use that to clamp down on free speech, to clamp down on civic space, to have this chilling effect on free speech in the society. So even though we still have these disinformation laws being retained in our legal systems, I posit that they do not really control the problem of fake news, and we need a more holistic approach to it.
Thank you so much, Angela. My next set of questions will now be to the colleagues from MISA. So in what ways does the Southern Africa AI report align with AU's continental strategy on AI, and are there any specific synergies or divergence areas?
We are guided by soft law and coming up with the Southern Africa AI report, and the recommendations that we have are also based on soft law that is already existing, and we also borrowed a bit from the EU. Again, I think it was raised earlier that a problem is that because of this vacuum where we don't have enough, we are doing copy and paste from other regions. Unfortunately, Africa is playing catch up. While other regions have come up with laws and regulations and frameworks, we are still not there, and we don't have best practice to copy from. If you look at bad things happen very fast. If you look at the AU protocols and soft law on cyber security, for example, as much as our laws adopted, our countries came up with cyber and data protection laws, whatever they're called respectively, we somehow learned to take the worst from each other. I think it's a race to the bottom. We never take the good things, we just take the bad things. And so we are trying to work around with the AU soft law and see how we can replicate it in Southern Africa and what our countries can also learn from this. I'll be really, really interested in seeing what Zambia has come up with, because I think it's the first country in Southern Africa to come up with an AI policy. South Africa is working on the same, but South Africa is a bit of an outlier in Southern Africa. It's like it's in the wrong place because it's well advanced compared to Zimbabwe, Malawi, Zambia, etc. So seeing and getting a model from South Africa could be a bit misleading. So we are interested in Zambia to see how far they have gone and what they've implemented what they've come up with in their laws, and we can see in their framework and see what we can adopt. Unfortunately, like most AU protocols and soft law, our countries never learn from it. If you look at the AU model law on access to information, no country in Southern Africa is anywhere close except South Africa, of course. If you look at the laws on online, cyber and etc., cyber laws and everything, it's all there on AU protocols, but no country is learning or taking away from it. I like the point that I think Angela raised, that we, instead of promoting it, we look for and call it computer misuse. Lesotho is actually working on its cyber law right now, and it's also about criminalizing online. It's never about the soft law. So again, if I can appeal to all of us really here, is also raise awareness on soft law, try and learn from best practices and engage governments on that. Those are nice documents that they have, and that it's nice for us as civil society to recite, but nobody is looking into them and nobody is implementing them. I don't know what we can do and how far we can push, but there's need for us to engage our governments on that. So as much as the report is on soft law, follows the AU soft law, my biggest worry is the willingness for governments to take these laws. They really, really do not care. And I think the onus is on us to see how we can raise awareness and how to push advocacy and how to come up with alternatives that we can use to compare. For example, if you look at Southern Africa in terms of media freedom, press freedom, Namibia is the best. And when we benchmark to Namibia, we can say, oh, look at what Namibia is doing, we can follow that. But when there is no one who has done anything, when there's no policy on AI in Southern Africa, it's very difficult to benchmark against another country. And again, I keep using this word, it creates a vacuum that will be filled by very bad laws.
Okay, thank you so much. You have something to add?
Yes, I would maybe continue from his point that we are benchmarking our frameworks based on these soft laws, but also it would be imperative to highlight that the AU now has the continental AI strategy, where they are recommending member states to come up with framework based on that strategy. But also it highlights on ethical sharing of information. And with many Southern African countries which do not have these AI strategies, they have to rely on their national data protection frameworks. The Zimbabwean context now, you have the National Data Protection Authority as POTRAS, which is the Postal Telecommunication Regulatory Authority. You expect a regulatory authority to be a neutral player, but now they are doubling as the regulatory authority for postal and telecommunication. On the other side, they are like they're dealing with the National Data Authority. We have data center, right? The data center, the hub is managed by Tel1, which is also like a player in the Post and Telecommunication Authority. So if you now tell how these strategies are implemented and who's dealing with what information, you then realize it's easy for Zimbabwe to say, oh, China, if you want to come up with certain data sets, we already have this Tel1 data center, because it's their own. And Potras, which is a regulator and in playing a double role, it makes it easy even to share other states with China or other nations. But also the other thing is on infrastructure and capacity building, where we are saying in Africa, yes, in as much as we might want to focus on AI strategy, and already the AU is talking about the content AI strategy and has set up frameworks, guides on how we should come up with frameworks. But Africa is more of like a hub of information or data which is not interpreted, it's not sorted. So how are we really going to do, and how are we really going to come up with an AI framework where we have these institutions or country members, which is the National Data Protection Authority, which has still loopholes. We haven't managed to at least ratify to suit the best standards. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And just based on your contributions and even the report findings, what are the key recommendations for policymakers in Southern Africa to better integrate AI into their development strategies?
So in terms of recommendations, some of our recommendations were strengthen data privacy and protection and laws. We were looking at aligning data privacy regulations with the international standards and ensure the effective enforcement. The other one was develop ethical guidelines and framework, establishing at least a clear ethical guideline for AI development, deployment, and addressing issues such as bias, discrimination, and accountability. We also felt there's need to invest in infrastructure and capacity building, support research, education, like you rightly said, and training in AI to build necessary infrastructure and the capacity. Then the last two are foster international collaboration. I feel it's time consuming for us to say as Southern Africa, Zimbabwe is working on its framework, Zambia is working on its framework, yet these are member states of SADC. They can just come with one framework, or a Sub-Saharan Africa, we can just come with one framework that suits our context. We may tweak it here and there to suit our different region context, but there is no need to then come up with frameworks as silos. Yet we are all member states of AU. In Southern Africa, we are member states of SADC. Then the last one was monitoring and evaluation. I feel we are good at coming with policies, endorsing them, stating that we have this convention, we have this framework, but no one monitors it. No one monitors its implementation. Even when it's being implemented, we don't benchmark and say, okay, we are at this level, maybe we need to look at these frameworks add here and there. We don't do such. We are just good at coming with policies, then it ends there.
Yep. Also, if I can just add on to what Chido said, some of the issues that we looked at was that ethics and law should ensure that AI serves as a public good. The application of international human rights law in the adoption of AI frameworks, I think it also a response to the question that you asked. Then, because we are an institution that looks at freedom of expression in the media, one of the recommendations was that whatever tools are implemented that don't, whatever policy on AI adoption does not affect or restrict freedom of expression and freedom of assembly. Also the right to privacy. AI, there's a risk of it getting into, infringing on our rights to privacy, and there's need for any framework to speak to that. Also a risk and assessment and impact, risk and impact analysis. I think Chido spoke about biases and identifying various risks. And also there's need for a technical oversight, which again speaks to monitoring and evaluation, but also looking at how it's being implemented and what impact it will have on society. And finally, I think Bridget spoke about it, ensuring transparency and accountability in any framework on AI policy framework that is adopted. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And now my next question is to Bridget. So can you help us understand the current state of generative AI and disinformation? Is it worsening an already existing problem, or how is it currently being moderated? How and what can we do to limit the harms that it may be exacerbating?
So the question as to whether Gen AI is worsening an already horrible problem, it's a bit neither here nor there. You can't definitively say yes, because disinformation has existed for a very long time. It's just always changed form. Disinformation used to be door-to-door gossip, then it turned into a text, then it turned to a WhatsApp message or a WhatsApp broadcast, then it turned into a tweet that goes viral, and now it might be a tweet that has a video that's a deepfake, right? But the reality is that also Gen AI just makes it more convincing. That's what I would say about Gen AI. Because if I can, and it's not easy, it's of course not the simplest thing to do, but if I can create a fake deep with someone said, and we saw that happening in the Kenyan elections a couple of years ago, where someone creates insightful content using a particular politician, and it's nothing that they actually said, right? So yes and no. It just makes it more easily scalable, makes it faster, makes it more convincing, but it's a problem that would have continued to exist anyway. As we talk about governance and moderation and policy and frameworks, one thing that I think is really important for us to name is that already information, or what we would say is the net product of generative AI, if that's what we want to call it, is already overly and poorly regulated. We don't need any more regulation on information. This is not to say that we should not have stopgap, we should not have mitigation, we should not have guidelines as to how things can be used, but we don't need any more criminalization of information. Already it's a saturated space, it's a saturated policy and legislative space where things are already as bad as they can be. So maybe we just need to streamline a little. But going back to what moderation looks like at the minute, moderation, when I think about it, takes two forms or two particular levels: at the training stage and at the implementation stage. At which the training, at the point of training, of course, there's specific data sets that are fed to a model, there's specific instruction that is given, there's specific limitations. So for instance, you can't go on ChatGPT and say, hey, please create some disinformation for me. And it's like, yeah, sure, why not? That's not gonna happen. A lot of the time, if everything works the way it's supposed to work, who knows? And then at the same time, after it's now being implemented and it's been released into the wild, there's policies that some companies are already employing, which for now looks like, at the very least, tagging specific content that has been created with artificial intelligence or Gen AI, and just things like this, mainly tagging and marking, and even something like community notes. I think that's been quite an interesting effort by X. Thinking about how to limit harms, two specific things or two general things. Number one, invest from the go. I think as a region, we've always faced this problem where We either import technology or it's made to seem as if it is completely necessary, but then there is no investment on this side of the world, which then means it ends up exacerbating harm. There are systemic risks that are not being addressed, and those need to be addressed before something is released as a public good or as a public infrastructure. For instance, I was just speaking about the student aid earlier or the agricultural aid earlier, pushing people further into the margins because those systemic risks have just not been adequately addressed. What we look like, our historical context, our societal context, it matters. And if that is not being taken into consideration at the end of the day, these harms are always going to continue to be exacerbated. And then the other thing I would say is that we need to streamline existing frameworks, guidelines, policies, legislation. This doesn't mean that we need entirely new legislation. Sometimes the governance of something new is as easy as adding an annexure or a regulation and operationalizing legislation or policy to a legislative effort that already exists. Streamlining also means removing harmful provisions in the legislations that we already have, as it has been made abundantly clear by everyone here at this point. Information is overly regulated. It's a lot of the time, I think even a lot of countries in the past few years have decriminalized something like defamation and at the same time enacted a cybercrime, cybersecurity, cyber misuse, computer misuse law that does exactly the same thing. So that means maybe removing those provisions, increasing human rights, data-led, evidence-led, research-led, human rights respecting legislation and policy mechanisms. So just looking at it from those 2 points of view, I think it'll put us in a pretty good position where then we can continue having these conversations. But at the same time, we need to go back to the very first question that I asked, is it necessary? A lot of the times it's not, and I think we're definitely at risk of falling into a place where we think that, yeah, AI is completely necessary for us to incorporate into our decision making, public governance, public infrastructure, and it isn't. It actually is not. There are so many other ways to do things that doesn't involve a system that could be biased because of how it's been trained, or it doesn't have adequate information. So is it necessary to turn to techno-solutionism when something hasn't worked for years? Is it evidence-based? Is it data-led? Is it research-based? Do we actually need to go in that direction? So explore other things, explore whatever already exists, and then try to figure out how to make sure that even if you are to indeed get to a point where this is the only thing that you can implement as a policy, then it is human rights respecting. There is mitigation in place to ensure that no one actually comes to harm in the ways that could have been prevented from the word go.
Thank you so much, Bridget. I'd like to now take questions from the floor. We're getting into the question and answer session. So if you have any questions to the panelists, we'll take them now. I don't know if you have someone who's moving around with the mics or...
Thank you very much. I want to thank all the panelists for their contributions. And I just want to, I had her clearly trying to speak about regulating this particular space and saying there's actually no need. And I think what we should be focusing on is mindset change. Sorry, I forget the name. However, I think we should all agree that laws are not made for the sake of making laws. They are made to actually, tell people that you must operate within certain limits. And when you go overboard, then there is need to take action. Just imagine if we had no law. what actually would be happening. It's good for people to know that the law exists so that you also know how you can actually behave yourself. I am saying this because we are all vulnerable. Don't think these laws are made for certain people. Just imagine what, with this artificial intelligence that you're actually discussing, just imagine if somebody picked my face now and puts this honorable member nude, naked. What would happen? Within a minute, it has gone viral. But somebody has intentionally destroyed you. By the time you wake up, I'm in a different, we are in Dakar, 3 hours, 3-hour difference with my country. By the time I wake up here, my photo has gone viral, showing that I'm actually naked somewhere, maybe with somebody, which is not true. By the time I correct that, the damage has been done. And now we are talking about most countries going into elections. Who knows what is going to happen next year, 2024? My country will be into elections, Malawi, I don't know, Tanzania, this year. So the laws are actually necessary. And I want us not to think that we lawmakers make laws to actually curtail freedom of speech. That's not the case. So I think let's appreciate why regulation is important, but let's only ensure that when it comes to implementation, the implementers don't implement these laws selectively or use these laws to actually abuse rights of other people, because this also happens. That is really just what I wanted to state.
Thank you so much. You could pass the microphone to the gentleman next to you.
Yes, thank you very much. And I would also like to appreciate the presenters and your contributions were really very rich. And I was also wondering whether the research paper is accessible for us to use it from here. Now, I wanted to relate the use of AI in today's era, which is where different people are enabled actually to use AI for different reasons. There are those who may use AI for good purposes. And these are the people perhaps that we are concerned of if their rights are not properly protected by the laws that we are passing or not over-regulated. But then we have those knowing that the use of AI has made it very easier for them to execute their plans, including extremists, knowing that using AI is more safe to them actually because they can execute a plan from their comfort zones. But this plan is very harmful to the citizens that the lawmakers ought to protect. So therefore, it is necessary for lawmakers to actually come up with laws that are balanced. The laws that are looking at those who want to use AI for positive sake, and again, those who want to use AI to destroy. So we have that responsibility of protection for both the right to safety, and in this case, it is when you put mechanisms, measures in place in terms of laws to protect and secure that safety net for your citizens. But then coming to, I was very interested with the narration by the advocate here, saying that many countries do not have laws that regulate the use of AI. I think perhaps is really a challenge. And this challenge is because AI is sort of a cross-border operational tool, where if you pass a law in a specific country, it may still lack that component of an making it actionable or enforceable, because an action is created in country B, but it is effected in country C. Now, when it comes to creating a law, the question of jurisdiction also comes to being. And now you look at will this law become actionable, or is just a fashion? It's just that of course country B has created a law which might not be actionable at the end of the day or enforceable. The same with certain courts, for instance, the AU court, which is very important, but when the actions or the decisions of that court is not actionable, is it really very much necessary to regulate on those aspects, or perhaps better to, like you say, strengthen the existing laws like data protection, cybersecurity laws, data strategic laws, and things like that, than an independent AI law. That's really where I have a question, and where I think we will continue to struggle to bring about an independent AI law. So those were my submissions.
Thank you so much. Before we continue the questions from the floor, I'd like to raise some questions from Hoover up. So whoever feels comfortable to answer these questions can just take it. So the first question, Big Tech has accrued ethical debt because of their "we'll fix it and consider it later" approach to ethical issues, which has caused untold privacy and security harms to their users globally. By failing to consider how their platforms or products or services can be misused or abused, Big Tech has caused untold harms to the rights and freedoms of its users. How will Africa ensure that its AI integration doesn't incur the ethical debt? Are there any contributions from the panelists?
I think, this is definitely something that's been spoken about to a great extent, just in a different kind of language or format. But what I would say is really just increasing the standard, whether internationally or in-country, regionally, standard and measure of human rights considerations. So whether this looks like human rights reporting, and these are just some of the advocacy tools that we already use. I think a lot of the measures that could be taken are not necessarily governed by laws, but they're advocacy tools that we have used in the past, and they're recommendations that we've made, especially towards policies that are housed within these companies that are being spoken about. And this just means looking towards human rights mechanisms such as due diligence, impact assessments, reporting, increasing the level and standard of the due diligence side of things, and just making sure that this is a continuous effort as opposed to just, and taking them up, really just making sure that people know what's going on, building that awareness, making sure people know what their rights are, ensuring that when organizations or companies come into countries, especially in the global majority, they pay attention to the laws that exist there, they don't flout laws, they impose or they adopt the most human rights respecting approach, whether that is within where they're operating or where they're domiciled.
Thank you so much, Bridget. Any other contributions to that question? Yes, Angela?
I think we also need to think about how meaningful engagements with big tech have been. I still feel that local communities might not really understand why we are talking about community guidelines, or why we are interested in the policies around content moderation. And therefore, I feel we need to empower the communities to be able to meaningfully engage with big tech. I think engagements with big tech should not just be cosmetic. They should not just be meetings where we're being told the terms and conditions of big tech, but they should be rooms and tables where local communities are able to input the policies that are eventually applied on them. So I just wanted to add on the part of meaningfully engaging big tech.
Thank you so much. I'll move on to the next question unless there's another contribution to. Okay, so the next question is, what are the regulations and legal obligations for an internet service provider being given the monopoly by government to provide connectivity? This in turn has resulted to suppression of citizens to access data and internet services. Anyone with a contribution to that? I could read the question again, right? Yeah, let me read the question again. So what are the regulations and legal obligations for an internet service provider given that there's the monopoly by government to provide connectivity? This in turn has resulted to suppression of citizens to access data and internet services.
I can just go now that I still have the mic. I think this really speaks on the corporate human rights responsibility that we have been asking from civil society for the longest time, that businesses need to see themselves as people whose operations can impact human rights in a positive way or in a negative way. I think this comes very strongly when we have government requests for information from internet service providers or telecommunications companies. I say this in the wake of the Kenya protests, and we saw how the government abductions of activists might have been facilitated by information sharing by telecommunication services. Now we understand that in the context of criminal investigations, there are times when the police will get this information from ISPs. But we want such sharing of information to be within the due process of the law. So for instance, having the necessary court orders to warrant the sharing of information. I think that's a very important point to make sure that ISPs do not violate human rights. We also want ISPs to be more transparent about the information they're sharing with the government, but also how they're mitigating human rights risks within their operations. So we have seen for a long time the so-called transparency reports, but sometimes they don't really give us enough information to know how they're engaging with government requests, for instance. So them keeping quiet does not really lift the veil of secrecy. Instead, it makes, there's this distrust between civil society, between the population and ISPs on the, the operations they conduct. Finally, it's to call for ISPs to understand that their acts or omission can affect internet connectivity. We know that internet shutdowns have to be facilitated by their cooperation. Internet shutdowns are not done unilaterally by governments. They're done in cooperation with several ISPs or companies that operate the undersea cables. So we want more transparency on that, more due process on that, because it's mostly left on a self-regulation banner so far. Just wanted to share those, and any panelists can add.
Yeah, just one small thing. First of all, agree with what you said, Angela, and there's a very delicate balance, especially for service providers and for corporates operating within a jurisdiction, right? Because they have to comply with the law, otherwise they face, possible deregistration, being removed from that jurisdiction. Their safety as well is always in question. But as Angela has said, there needs to be a lot of transparency around what information is shared, and this is why we recommend transparency reporting. ISPs always have the power to push back. That's something that kind of gets lost sometimes in the weeds. They have the ability to push back. You can say no. If it goes against the laws, you can say no. You can ask for quota, as Angie said, but also the reality is that sometimes there are broad exemptions within the laws of a certain jurisdiction that enable authorities to ask for particular information and for ISPs to have to give it. But generally also with that legislation as it's being created, something that's a proactive measure to take for ISPs, for all stakeholders, including ISPs that is to also engage with those processes, because I think a lot of the time we're kind of stuck giving comments by ourselves or making submissions by ourselves to legislators, and they can come in and share perspectives also from an ISP perspective that this might lead to a breach of our policies or our commitments to our consumers. There are laws that exist that protect consumers as well, and those need to be paid attention to, whether this means in the legislative process or the implementation process.
Thank you so much, Bridget and Angela. Edmund, you have something to add?
I just wanted to say something on jurisdiction from Honorable. And when he was asking about the challenge of jurisdiction, since AI is cross-border, and indeed that is a challenge, but I think the point of departure would be when developers, tech companies, innovators are developing AI in their respective countries. I think it is key that there is a regulation for them, so that when they are developing the software or the model, it's in tandem with the principles and ethical, responsible use. And one of the other things to look at are the different regional instruments, resolutions passed by the African Commission, UNESCO, and UN, guiding principles on business and human rights, because they give a guidance. So if we have regulations that mirror some of these principles and guidelines, we'll have a uniform regulation in our respective jurisdiction. And when it comes to enforcement, even if it is cross-border, it becomes a bit easier. So basically it's a big challenge, but I think we can start from there. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. Chido?
I would also like to add from the Honorable's contributions. I'm not sure how member states define AI and what they feel AI is, but taking from my colleague's contribution, that we really need maybe to add a section that will deal with AI, because some of the examples highlighted, even the Cyber Security and Data Protection Act can deal with such aspects. But also, I wanted to note that some of the international frameworks that we are benchmarking our AI strategies, like the European Union Act, this act, the AI Act, is based on proposing a risk-based approach to AI regulation, categorizing AI systems based on their potential risk. Then the G7 principles is also based on focusing on promoting trust, safety, security, and AI development. We have the OECD AI principles, which is on ethical considerations such as fairness, transparency, accountability. So now the question is, in Africa, with this framework, what is the motive? What do we want to achieve? Do we want to measure the risk, assess the risk, or we want the frameworks to focus on transparency, accountability of this framework, or is it about promoting trust using these AI technologies? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chido. I'll take 2 more questions from the floor. Sorry, so we'll have to wrap up now. And I will ask the panelists to just share their parting shots, and that will be it.
Okay, I'll start. Okay, I can't re-emphasize the issue of raising awareness and working together, not in silos, and coming up with a model that we can all adopt well, I can only speak for Southern Africa because that's where we work, but coming together as civil society and setting up a platform, even where we engage policymakers on what kind of framework we want and what to adopt. But there is need for us to raise awareness and start acting now, because if we don't do that, governments will beat us to that. Thank you.
Just super shortly, I would say, let us question a little bit more. Let's question a little longer before, especially, we implement programs that affect people's daily lives. Let's question the necessity, and after we've done that, let's implement in a manner that respects people and humans' rights, and it takes care of the people who are often and mostly left at the margins.
My parting shot would be on monitoring and evaluation of this framework. In the event that we come up with this AI strategy, let's come up with a roadmap which guides us as we go, as we formulate these strategies. And also, the other one is on maybe as Sub-Saharan Africa, that taking a leaf from your contribution, that sometimes there's no need for us to keep up, coming up, developing frameworks. Let's work with the ones that we already have, the Data Protection Act. Let's deal with the loopholes of the Data Protection Act. Then I think we have a seamless flow to the AI strategy. It makes it easy. But now, coming up with an AI strategy when the data protection framework has these loopholes, it means we'll keep on referring to the Data Protection Act, or we snag some clawback provisions from the Data Protection Authority frameworks to the AI frameworks.
What I can say when it comes to freedom of expression and generative AI, freedom of expression has been subject to adjudication in different courts, and courts has held it as sacrosanct that it's very key for all citizens and all people to have the right to freedom of expression. So if we are looking at laws, either reviewing or coming up with specific laws that that regulate content generated by AI, we should look at the 3 tests that courts have actually looked at. And it takes us back to the Constitution, because freedom of expression is not absolute, but there are some justifiable reasons. And so the question is, if you're coming up with a law, what is the spirit behind that law? Is it about suppressing a specific group of people, or it is about the rights, the other rights of other people? So the most important question we need to ask ourselves is this going to prevent harm? And 2 is maintain public order and protect national security. Unfortunately, our governments have used the last 2 of maintaining public order and protect national security. So I think we need to focus mainly on the rights that, if I'm expressing myself with the tools that I have, these tools should not harm my neighbor. Thank you.
My parting shot will be that generative AI presents a challenge and an opportunity. An opportunity to redefine corporate human rights obligations, because I think AI companies were in the Wild West. They were experimenting, they were trying things out, and it worked. And we know it worked because we saw the product. So the challenge to us now is to respond in a way that upholds human rights, responds in a way that is African, in that it's taking into consideration our context. We know our context from a political point of view. We know our context from a digitalization point of view. We know our context from how we have been interacting with tech. So how do we do that? How do we ensure we still respect human rights?
Thank you so much for your parting shots and for your contributions, and thank you so much for listening into this session. Any further questions or areas of consideration can be raised through the Hoover app, and the panelists will address them there. And thank you and have a good day.